Welcome to Lesson 3, where we are with Quilt Basics, half square triangle blocks, pillows, and quilts. I'm Elizabeth, and this is Liz.
Hi. In the first two lessons, you learned how to make a half square triangle unit. You learned how to put those half square triangles together to form blocks. We did pinwheel blocks. Then in the second lesson, we learned how to put all of those blocks together to make a quilt top. Now it's time to take that quilt top and turn it into a quilt.
So in this lesson, you're going to learn what a quilt sandwich is that you will hear often spoken of in the quilting world. And you're going to learn how to quilt it on your home machine, so you don't need a fancy machine to quilt it. And then the very last thing we're going to do is learn how to put on the quilt binding.
All right, let's get started. Looks like we've got the quilt sandwich laid out right here for us. Let's talk about what that is.
Let's do. So a quilt sandwich is basically, our quilt top is the top layer of the sandwich. You can think of that as part of the bread. And in the middle, we have batting. We've chosen a warm and natural batting, which is a pretty thin batting, but there's lots of different types of batting. There's polyester battings, there's high loft battings, which are a little bit thicker, there's low loft battings, all different kinds. You'll find your preference as you keep quilting. But if you're sewing on a home machine, we really love the warm and natural or the warm and white, which is a cotton batting that's thinner, but it still gives a great fluff when your quilt is washed.
Exactly.
And then our very last layer of our sandwich is our quilt backing. We are using a solid here on our quilt backing, but if you were using a print, you would need to make sure that the correct side of your fabric, the right side of your fabric, is facing down on your sandwich. So face that one down, then the quilt batting is in the middle, and then your quilt top is facing up so that you have your full quilt ready to go.
I'm going to interrupt you really quickly.
Go for it.
The method that we're showing you right now of how to assemble your quilt is one that we personally like, and it's if you're going to quilt it yourself. But at this point, once you've built your quilt top, there are several different choices that you have to finish off your quilt. You don't necessarily have to do it like this. You can always scent it off to be long arm quilted, which we've done quite a bit, and it always turns out beautiful. Or you can tie your quilt, which I do often. I have my own set of frames, and I love to tie my quilts. So there's different choices. You don't need to necessarily do it like this, but this is a good choice that we like to use.
Let's talk about one more thing that I just thought of before we start. So in making the quilt sandwich, you're actually going to have your bottom layers and your batting a little bit bigger than your quilt top. If you're sending it off to a long arm quilter, or you know a long arm quilter that you're taking your quilt to, a lot of them have specific dimensions that they like their quilt backs bigger than their quilt tops. The girl who does it for us likes a 3-inch perimeter around the quilt back that is bigger than the quilt top, so she has room to long arm it. So if you are taking it to a long armer, you might want to make sure you have those dimensions correct before you make your quilt back.
Perfect, perfect. All right.
Okay, so now that we know what a quilt sandwich is, we need to talk about one other quilting term, which is the word basting. And basting and quilting is not like turkey basting. But it's quilt basting, and it's basically temporarily holding the 3 layers of your quilt together while you quilt it on either a machine or a long arm. Again, if you're taking your quilt top to a long arm quilter, you are not going to baste. All you're going to do is take your quilt top and your quilt backing to the long arm quilter. They will put it on frames, which actually holds the 3 layers together, and then quilt it from there. But because we're doing this on our machine at home, we need to make sure that the top and the batting don't start shifting, because if you see, they can do that easily.
And while we're only working on a small piece and you won't see the shifting quite as much, once you start moving that much fabric through your small sewing machine, it really has a tendency to shift and slide, and where you're sewing and where you want to be sewing isn't always in the same place.
So there's a couple different methods to baste a quilt. We'll talk about a couple and then tell you about our favorite. So there are quilting pins that look like this. This is a regular, put that down there. This is a regular safety pin, and this is a quilting pin, and you can see that it has it makes a V shape on the top of the pin. And these are actual quilting pins. You can use safety pins if you had some around, or even the bigger safety pins, kind of the larger diaper pins that are readily available as well. But if you're going to use the pin basting method, what you're going to do is make sure that your quilt sandwich is flat and smooth and ready, just as if you'd want to take it over to your machine. And then I like to always start in the middle because then I can work my way out and smooth as I go. You're just going to put your pin in towards the bottom, make sure you've got all of your layers, and then pull it back up and then close it.
Got it.
And then you're just going to keep doing that method. Obviously, we just have a very small quilt today, but if you were working on a big surface, you're going to need a big floor space with a hard surface to be able to pin baste your quilt. And then you're going to place these pins about every 4 to 5 inches apart, I think is a good number. Some people go a little bit lower, some people a little bit higher, but I think around 4 to 5 inches is a good amount to keep your whole quilt sandwich in place.
So if you were doing the pins for the quilt that we have hanging behind us, I would put the pins in the middle and on the corners. Mm-hmm. Is that what you would do as well?
Yep, because this is going to be about a 5.5 inch section, so that would work.
All right.
And then second, our method, I'm just going to bring this over here, this is called quilt basting spray. There's several different brands that you can buy. It's not very expensive, and basically you can see from the pictures, it's kind of like a temporary glue for all 3 of the layers, but it washes out when you wash the quilt for the first time. So it's a really fast method for basting. And how I do it is I get my sandwich.
Let's undo our pin really quick.
Thank you, thank you.
There you go.
I basically start in the center of my quilt again. I lay everything out, and I usually am working on kind of a flat surface, so I take either some like masking tape or painter's tape and just tape down all 4 corners of my quilt bottom face down. Remember, your good side is facing down. And then I roll everything back to the middle of my quilt. Then I take a little bit of spray basting and spray it in that middle section. And then all I start doing is unrolling this. A little more spray, unrolling this so you can kind of make it smooth and flat and ready for quilting.
Yep. And it's the same thing, always working from the middle out. Love it.
And then you're going to repeat that same exact process to adhere your quilt top to your piece of batting that's there. Once you have all of that done, you are ready for quilting.
All right. When you're quilting, you're going to want, ideally, to change over your foot to a walking foot. Now, you don't necessarily need to. You can try on a small piece, a scrap at home, and see if your regular sewing foot can handle the bulk of your quilt. Sometimes it can, sometimes it can't. I have 2 different machines. One machine can handle it with a regular foot, and I just use a regular foot quite a bit. Another machine can't, and so a walking foot works best. Walking foot would be best practice. We were just learning today why walking foot works so marvelously to do machine quilting with. And that's because the bottom of your machine has feet that will move your fabric along. Normally that's just fine, but once we get all these chunky layers going on here from our quilt, we want that walking foot to also have feet that help the fabric walk through. So now you have feet on the bottom and feet on the top that are helping walk your fabric through your machine at the same rate. So the bottom's not going faster than the top is. So you're going to have like a nicely quilted pattern.
And there's another sewing term for you. So those are called feed dogs. I know there's lots of weird terms in sewing and quilting, but there's another one. So
yes,
those are feed dogs on the bottom, and then you'll have
feet that look like they're marching down there are the feed dogs.
Exactly. Okay, so now that you have your walking foot on, and every sewing machine is going to be a little bit different with that. So you might need to get out your sewing machine manual, figure out how to put your walking foot on, and make sure it's on correctly, and then you are ready to go. The only other thing with quilting, and we already have this machine preset, is I like to lengthen my stitch length a little bit. So I normally sew, if I'm piecing a quilt at either a 2 or a 2.5, when I'm quilting, I like to move it up so there's a few less stitches per inch, and I usually move it up to about a 3 or a 3.5 on my stitch length.
Yeah, and it really does. It helps with pulling your fabric too tight and helping prevent puckering. So just lengthening it just a little bit really is a helpful tip.
Again, I think that's personal preference. I'm sure that as you go along, you will find a stitch length that you love and that works well for quilting for you. But try lengthening just a titch and see how it goes.
All right, now before I just go to town with my sewing machine and quilting, we are going to put some lines on our quilt first, on our mini quilt.
So our mini quilt today, there are so many different methods of quilting on your actual home machine. With the walking foot, we can do straight line quilting, we can do some lattice quilting, which is kind of diagonal lines going this way and diagonal lines going that way. You can do lots of things. There's also a free motion quilting foot that you can buy for your sewing machine that gives you a lot more movement on your sewing machine, and that you can actually physically move the quilt instead of the machine doing it, and you can make lots of free motion quilting designs that are available today. We're just talking about a very basic beginner technique of just doing straight line quilting with our walking foot.
Yep. So let's show how to do this. The first thing that we're going to need to do is draw our lines on. So we're going to use our Frixion pens again that erase magically when you...
Which I don't think we've shown you yet. We still need to show you how they erase. We'll show you after the quilting.
Yes, we will show you after this, which is, I have a tip really quick before this. Once I did draw all the lines on my quilt, then I thought, oh, I need to give it one quick last pressing, and I erased all of my lines with the iron. So before you draw your lines on, make sure you've got your quilt all pressed and ready to go, which it is. So pick your color.
All right. So let's do this blue so it shows up. All I'm going to do, and this is a small piece, so I'm going to use kind of our cutting mat because it has a ruler built into it to show how to work on this. But basically, if you can see, I've kind of lined my pinwheel quilt block up with this line on my cutting mat. So I know that I'm starting in the middle, and I know I'm starting with one straight vertical line. So I can work out from there. And you don't really need to put a line down this one because we already have a line down the center of our block, but I will just put it on there just so that you can see that pen line. And then, should we do 1 inch?
Let's do 1 inch.
Let's do 1 inch. So I'm always working from the middle because I'm trying to keep everything straight and square. So I work out from the middle, and all I'm going to do is draw 1 inch lines. One tip that I use, instead of lining up with this line that I just drew, I always tend to come back to that middle line. So I'm trying to keep it as square and as straight as possible from the middle. Sometimes even if you get this 1/16 of an inch off and then you're using that line to measure, by the time you're 8 inches down, you're going a little twisty.
You are.
Which is okay, but not ideal for what we're looking at. So I'll move this. Oh, I got talking and then I never drew the line. All right, let's get that 2 inch line down.
Perfect.
We'll just do a couple more so you've got quite a few lines on here. And again, I'm always measuring from this middle line to try and keep everything straight and square and ready to go. One other tip that really helps me to keep things straight and square is when I am sewing a line, I will start sewing in this direction. And then when I come off and I go to the next line, I'm actually going to flip this whole thing around and I'm going to start sewing from that direction. So sometimes your fabric can start pulling in one direction, and then by the time you get over here, you've kind of stretched this one corner out.
That's true.
So if you sew one going one direction and the next one going a different direction, it can help keep things a little more square too.
For sure. And with sewing, as we're sewing, just bringing this over to the machine, we do the same thing we have done from the beginning. We are going to sew from the middle and work our way out. It's just always a good rule of thumb. Start in the middle and work your way out. Now with this, I'm just sewing right down that middle line. Now you can see that I'm using bright red thread. Normally on this quilt I would not be using bright red thread, but we'd like you to see the stitching on this. I suppose you could use bright red thread if you wanted some serious contrast.
If you wanted some contrast. Sometimes fun to do contrast, but I'm not sure red would probably be the best on this one.
I'm not sure red would be my choice, but you'll be able to see the stitching. So I'm going to get down here to the end. Whoop, got a little off course. I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to flip it, and then we're going to work our way down the next row. Now you can see with this piece that we're quilting, it's really easy because it's such a small piece. But you'll find that it's a little bit more cumbersome when you're doing an entire quilt. And you'll find yourself doing some creative folding and tucking of the remainder of the fabric as you're working your way across your quilt.
I do like to have a big space kind of to the left of my sewing machine if I know I'm going to be quilting a quilt. You could, if you have a smaller sewing table, I mean this one is nice and big and perfect, but if you have a smaller table, you can kind of set up another table to the left of your machine just to hold some of the bulk and the weight of that quilt so it's not pulling you down as you're quilting it.
Exactly. All right, and I'm just going back and forth, flipping it every time. Now we cheated, we didn't really baste this top and bottom down at all. So it is shifting on me just a little bit. You'll be able to see it as I'm working through it. Basting is always important, even if it's a small space. All right, we're halfway there. Clip this
And you can
guy.
kind of see the effect of how it's quilting the actual quilt, which is we were temporarily holding those in place and now we're actually holding those layers in place. So the quilt will have warmth in the middle and still look great.
Yes. All right. Here we go again. I should quilt a little faster. I'm just scared because it's not stuck together.
You're doing great.
I'm going a little off course. But in just a minute, you'll see that we're going to make those lines go away. And you won't be able to tell as much. Okay, 2 more to go. Just going straight down the middle.
Once you start with this is a very, very basic technique with straight line quilting, but it really makes the quilt look great. I've done this on lots of baby quilts, lots of mini quilts that I've just made at home. I love straight line quilting. Liz knows I am a straight line quilting fan.
You are. You've like straight line quilted since day 1.
I really, really like it.
Okay, we're on our last section right here.
I like the look of, some people do like the matchstick quilting, which is really, really thin lines.
It's beautiful. You can hear as I'm sewing, I was going to talk about this, you can see this walking foot move as I'm sewing, and you can hear it click.
It kind of jumps like a frog almost, that it's kind of jumping forward where it's pulling the quilt top through as the feed dogs are pulling the bottom through.
So it sounds a little bit different. It's a little bit noisier than your regular foot, but it's awesome.
That means it's doing its job.
That's right. Okay, here we go. Now this one especially, I'm on the side of, so you're going to be able to really see this pen line disappear here in just a minute.
So after you've quilted, we're going to pretend like she quilted this whole side, and then you would either mark the second side or you could mark it all at the beginning and then quilt your whole quilt. If you wanted to go back and do horizontal lines with your vertical lines, you could do that with cross hatching.
I like to do that.
It's really cute. Cross hatching is really cute too. All right, we ready to make it disappear?
Yes, let's make it disappear.
Let's pull this in. And all we're going to do is apply heat to those pens, and you can see it's already gone. And by the time those lines disappear, you can't even tell if you were off a little bit.
Yes, it's wonderful.
It's seriously like magic.
I actually kind of like the red thread too, by the way. That's really fun. I always
You're
use the
coming
same.
around.
Yeah.
Contrasting is kind of fun.
All right.
So that is our quilt. So we've done our quilt sandwich, we've done our quilting, And now we need to bind our quilt.
This part takes the longest for me. Elizabeth's really quick at hand binding. This is the longest part for me.
And we're going to talk about two methods of binding. The one that we'll demonstrate today is a hand binding method, but there's also a machine binding method where you can bind the quilt using your sewing machine for sewing both sides. For the hand binding method, we're going to use the machine to sew the binding on top, but then on the bottom, we're actually going to hand stitch it in so it's a little more invisible. Yep. I like a little hand stitching. I can put on a good movie, find something fun on Netflix and that you've already seen a million times you can just listen to and hand bind a quilt. Especially in front of the fireplace on a cold night. It's kind of one of my favorite things to do.
Actually, I always do my hand binding on road trips. I pile everything on top of me and just bind as we go down the road. Okay, you've already chopped up our binding for us. Let's talk about this.
So, quilt binding is the actual process of enclosing our quilt sandwich. Oh, let's talk about one thing first, though.
Okay.
Let's talk about trimming our quilt up. We forgot that.
Oh, yes, let's trim our quilt up.
Let's do that first. So what we're going to do is, remember we've made our batting and our quilt backing a little bit larger because sometimes during the quilting process things can shift and you don't want to show batting on the back of your quilt. You actually want to show your cute backing that you've made or found. So after you do all of your quilting, we need to trim off this excess that's there.
All right.
Do you want to do that?
Yeah, for sure. So the way that we do this is we just use the quilt itself that we squared up earlier, and we're just going to use that. I'm going to go off the lines of the quilt.
If you feel like your quilt has shifted, you are welcome to do that squaring technique again that we talked about in lesson 2. But we're on such a small surface, we're good.
All right, this guy's already open, so I'm just gonna trim him off. Oops, we didn't catch him all the way right here. Just gonna trim up all of the edges. Now, I did see someone recently who had some problems with her binding, and her biggest problem was she said her binding was so bulky she couldn't get, or the edges of her quilt was so bulky she couldn't get her binding around, and all she had forgotten to do was this one very last step, which was cut all of the excess off the edges. So she was trying to tuck all of this extra batting and backing into her binding, and it just wasn't working out for her. Okay. 2 more sides, and we'll call this guy good. I'm just squaring him up with the sides of the block right here, getting rid of that excess, and go all the way through again. There we go. And one last side.
We've been doing so much cutting, we have a dull blade.
I know. Okay, last guy. And swipe him down. Done. Okay, now we can add our binding.
All right, now we're ready. We've got our quilt top all evened up and squared away. Okay, let's talk about binding for a minute. There are several methods for making binding. There is straight binding or there's bias binding. I find for beginners, I think you would agree, that straight binding is probably the way to go at the beginning. This is just fabric that's cut on the straight of grain, and so it doesn't shift or move. You can kind of tug on it and it doesn't. Bias binding is also fantastic. Some people love bias binding. And if you are doing a quilt with curving, any sorts of curves or any sorts of
curved edges, like around the edges.
If you do a scalloped quilt or you need some of that tug, then bias binding is the way to go. And bias binding is simply taking your fabric and you're actually cutting it on the bias so that your piece of binding has a little bit of give when you go around the quilt. Okay, so today we're going to talk about straight binding. We already have these cut. I like to cut my binding to 2.5 inches.
That's exactly what I cut mine to.
Some people do a little more, some people do less. I know a lot of people who love 2.25 for kind of a skinnier binding. I think a good middle of the road is 2.5 inches for binding. So basically, you need to just measure around the perimeter of your quilt. I'm a big guesstimator though, so I sometimes just guesstimate how many pieces I think I'm going to need. But if you want to be really accurate, you're going to measure around the perimeter of your quilt and then give yourself some ease so that you have enough to go all the way around it. So cut your straight pieces of fabric. And then I do like to join my binding using a mitered corner. So all I'm going to do here when I'm joining two pieces of binding, here let me move this up so that you can see it a little bit better, is I take my binding and I'm going to basically I have to think of it as a T, and sometimes I really have to do this every single time. I'm going to make a T with both of my pieces of binding, and then if you can see right here, it makes a V. So I think T-U-V. Okay, I'm looking for the V to the V. So all I do is take my ruler and my marking pen, and I'm going to make a line from V to V, or from like open mouth Pac-Man to open mouth Pac-Man, if you're a Pac-Man fan. And I'll stick one pin in this just for you because I don't want it to shift while taking it to the machine.
Perfect, thank you.
Oh, if I can get it in there, there it goes. All right, so she's gonna take this over to the machine, and all she's gonna sew is from that V shape to the V shape. And we'll show you what happens.
Yes, this is like magic. The first time I saw this, it blew my mind. I wasn't expecting it. Okay, so I'm gonna put this guy back down, and we're just gonna sew right through.
We've still got our stitch length a little bit up. I would move yours back down just a little bit, but we're just kind of demonstrating it. If you're doing your own, 3.5 might be a little, it might pull out.
Might be a little loose. All right, we'll cut that. Let's get that guy up. Okay, here we go. So he's just back exactly the way you handed him to me.
All right, so now all we're going to do is either take your scissors or your rotary cutter, and we're just gonna trim off these excess pieces of binding right here. Just trim them right off. And then when you open these, it makes that continuous binding look where it almost looks like you have a mitered corner like you have on your edges of your quilt, but it will give you a continuous look all the way around your quilt.
Right, and it's a more professional look than if you just sewed straight across and your seam was going just vertically across right here. All right.
And then if you, after you press these, I would just cut off I call them dog ears of your little thing. So all we're going to do is take these over to the iron now. And I'm just going to press it to one side. Get that on there. And then see, I have that great seam line on my quilt binding right there.
That's awesome.
The next step is still going to be over here at our...
Yes.
All we're going to do is fold our quilt binding in half. If you have a right and wrong side, you need to make sure your wrong side is in the middle and the right side of your fabric is out so that you can see right side and right side on the front and back. You're going to take your binding pieces and press them in half. I sometimes find it really relaxing to cut up a whole bunch of fabric and just make yards and yards of binding. I'm really bizarre, but I love that. And then I love to roll them and sit them on a little shelf, and then I can go pick which binding I think is going to look fantastic.
You do have rolls of binding on your shelf.
I love binding. I tend to use this sometimes even in garment sewing. If I'm not doing a curve, like if I want a really great finish on the bottom of a skirt or something that's not a curve, I use straight binding. I like to make bias binding for my own garments as well. Okay, I think this is probably enough to get us started.
Yeah, we're almost there.
Let me do one more.
Just get us past that seam.
Yep.
All right.
Okay, so I'm just going to move this back out of the way. untangle my binding from under there a little bit. There we go.
All right, we'll show you how to add this binding onto your quilt.
So let's talk about the machine binding method first. If I was going to bind this whole thing with my machine, I'm actually going to turn my quilt over, and I know there's several techniques to do this, but this is how I do it. So I forgot to show you one thing my little end trick that I always do. Let me pull this back over.
Oh, yes. This is a great little time-saving trick, and it helps make your binding look really professional when you get to the end.
Oh, I'm all sorts of caught up in
There
here.
we go.
There we go.
We got it.
Thank you. So on the very end of my binding, I tend to make a right angle right here. And I don't want my selvages in there. So I just press this at a right angle wherever I'm going to start with my binding. And then I'm going to press it back together right here.
Perfect.
Okay, and then I'm just going to show you up here so that, because I'm not sure we're going to be able to see this really well on the quilt, so I will kind of explain what we're doing. So I'm just going to trim this part off right here. And this is going to be the start of my binding. So I'm going to use this to go all the way around the quilt, but then when I come back around, I'm going to have my binding, my end seam, slip right into my first seam, and then I'm just going to sew that onto the quilt. So it kind of mimics those other seams that we had been doing, and it makes this seam to blend in with your quilt a lot better.
It does. It looks really great when you do it like that.
So there's just a quilting trick for you of how I finish. All right, let's go back to machine binding.
Yes, machine binding.
So if I'm doing machine binding, I would start my binding on the back of my quilt, and I would stitch 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch along this line. Then I would turn it over to the front.
You do your whole entire perimeter.
And I'll show you how to do the corners. We'll do those in just a second. But then this would fold over to the front, and then you would, it's called stitch in the ditch. So you would stitch right along right here, and then it would catch the back in it as well. Some people are really great quilters and they can do it on the top and stitch in the ditch to the back. I'm not that straight.
No.
So I like to do that method. You can do it on the top if you'd like to as well though.
And an advantage to machine binding it like that is just for the reason that it's so quick. It really is a quick method to bind your quilt. We both like the hand binding method just because it really looks nice when it's done. I mean, really, it looks nice. Plus, especially if we're giving it as a gift, it's kind of nice to have like that handmade touch that goes along with your quilting.
I was just going to say it's kind of a nod to the quilting of yesteryear when everything was done by hand, and I just feel like some little part of a quilt should have that hand stitch touch in it.
Agreed.
All right, so let's talk about the hand binding method. I'm going to start right here. I am going to use a few pins to just show you.
Don't burn yourself on the iron.
Okay, let's move that out of the way.
Okay.
Then we can put that right there. So this method is you're just going to put your binding on top of your quilt sandwich, and you are going to pin. When you come to one of the corners, you're going to measure in 1/4 of an inch and either mark it with a dot or put a pin in it. So there we've got our mark right there at 1/4 of an inch. And what's going to happen is when you get down, you are going to stop at that 1/4 of an inch. And then you're going to fold your corner up.
And when we mean stop, cut your thread.
Stop.
Pull your quilt out.
Then after let's do that first.
Okay, let's do it.
I think it will be easier to demonstrate when that's already sewn.
Okay, so we're just gonna start here at Liz's tricky corner and put you down in here, feet down.
If you'll just start kind of down
Right
below
here?
that guy, then we can shove the end guy inside of him
Oh,
at the very end.
Easier. Okay.
Yep.
10-4. Got it. Okay. There he goes. We were just having this discussion earlier about how Elizabeth likes to use the walking foot when she puts her binding on as well. So I always use my regular foot. We've got the binding foot, and I still have it on this longer stitch length, which I would not be using normally if I was binding a quilt. Okay, I'm just putting my finger on the end, right here where this mark is. Okay, I'm here at the end, so I'm stopping all the way and cutting, and I'm pulling it out of my machine. Okay.
Okay, if you're ready to do your binding, you might have to watch this a couple times. But after you've done a whole quilt with 4 corners, by the 4th corner, you'll be like, I got it, I got it. It took me one whole quilt to kind of figure this out. What you're going to do is where this 1/4 inch mark is you're going to turn it. And look, we have our pinwheel to follow on this one right here. You're going to make a 45-degree angle right there.
And let's just finger press it, which just means just using your fingernail and just putting a little crease in there for her fabric right there.
And that's all I do is right there. So we're at this point. All we have to do next is hold this part down, and then you're going to make your binding come over the top. And then you're going to start sewing right here and go down to the next thing. Let me show you one more time so you've got it. I tell you, this is the trickiest part of binding.
This is the trickiest part.
So you have your fabric going straight down. You're going to fold it at a 45-degree angle. Finger press that really well. Pick it up. And then put it right back down on top so that it matches on both sides. You can stick a pin right here, because this part you won't even sew by over here. And then your next line is going to go starting at the very edge, which is going to seem counterintuitive. You kind of think you're tangling it all up in there, but you're really not. You're making a mitered corner on your quilt. So Liz is going to start sewing right here all the way down until a 1/4 inch from that guy right there.
All right, let's do this. Now, Elizabeth said that by the end of your first quilt, you will have this down. I did not.
I'm sure you did.
I did not. I had to watch how to do this several times, but once I've got it, now I've got it. And it does make beautiful corners on your quilt. It really does. Okay, here we go. And I'm just going to hold this tight. All right.
I think even if you sew us halfway down, then we can show that corner on there.
Sorry, I'm just going to give you a little bit more room so
Perfect.
when you show hand binding, you've got a little bit of space.
True.
You'll have a little bit of space. We'll just get down here a little ways. And we'll call that good for right now. Okay. All right, show us the magic.
All right. You're going to think you did this wrong. You really are. When you see this, you're going to think, what in the world happened right there? But if you'll watch, when we flip this over to the back side, and I take out my crease that I finger pressed right there, and I come around to the back, I'm going to fold on one side. I'm going to make that right angle fold on this side, and I'm going to make my mitered corner on the back. I'm going
to grab you some clips.
Stick some Wonder Clips in there. Whoops, I lost half of it. I feel like my fingers are getting in the way. But so all I'm doing is folding down one way, kind of finger pressing at that 45-degree angle, and then pulling this in and making that mitered corner. I sometimes putz with these until I feel like I have it right, like I would move that one over and redo it a couple times. But let me show you that corner that it makes on this side. So where we've stopped at that 1/4 inch, it makes that perfect mitered corner on the front side of the quilt as well.
Which I love when it comes off of the angle of the quilt just like that and right into the mitered corner. That makes my heart happy.
It's the little things.
It is. It makes
It's
my
the little
nerdy
things.
quilting heart happy.
Okay, we talked about wonder clips. I'm going to redo this guy one more time to see if I can get it a little better. Sorry,
I wouldn't redo it, but she would redo it.
Actually, I would redo it this way.
You're
I
a corner
think.
perfectionist.
I like corners. Okay, see, I'm much happier with that corner.
It does look beautiful.
Perfect. We talked about these wonder clips before. They are fantastic for holding something in place temporarily. Even if you're sewing with like leather or thicker materials, they work great for that. Somebody told me I use them upside down, but I like them this way. I don't know, which way do you use them?
I think you use them upside down.
I'll put some on right side up just for you, Liz.
I like the color looking at me.
All right, we'll do some Liz's way and some my way. I think the upside down method holds it a little tighter, but I think I'm just bizarre. So after you have all of your binding sewn on, you're going to repeat that corner process with all 4 sides of your quilt. And then what you're going to do is take your binding and using your trusty dusty wonder clips or whatever you have,
Or
binder clips.
Binder clips. That's commonly used as binder clips.
I've seen those hair clips that you kind of clip in and out. You can use those, or you can use pins. Although I tend to stick myself if you have this big quilt.
Yeah. I stick myself when it's too many pins.
Okay, so now we're going to show you how to hand bind. Obviously, I would trim all of these little threads that are in there as well. You're just going to take some thread.
I'm going to see if I can pull out. This is a brand new pack of needles.
They sometimes get in there pretty tight.
They are in there wicked tight.
I'm going to take a piece of thread, and I feel like this is a little bit long to show you, so I'm going to kind of do that in half right there.
I'm going to have to pull them out this way. Don't watch. Close your eyes.
Oh, no. I thought you were going to use it as pliers. I'm actually glad you were just cutting it. I do pry it off. No.
I do lots of things the wrong way, but I was not going to use this scissors.
It's better than your teeth, I guess, Liz.
I like your faith in me, though.
Oh, goodness.
Okay, here's you a needle.
All right. So hand binding. Just going to thread that needle.
You have to have good eyes for threading your needle. I have to use my reading glasses.
Actually, I was hoping, hopefully I could do this. I can't see very well. And then I tie a knot in the bottom. And I'm just going to clip this little extra off right after the knot.
That's funny. I've never seen you tie a knot before. Like, I do it my grandma's way where you lick your finger and do that gross thing. I love it.
I've actually never tied a knot that way. All right, so here we go. So I'm just going to start right over here where this wonder clip is.
Sorry, you're still thinking about me and that knot.
I'm still thinking about you prying open the needles with scissors. All right.
All right.
So what I like to do, and obviously we're using binding that's the same color as our backing, so I probably would use gray thread, but we're just going to show this with white today.
And normally we wouldn't use binding that was the same color as our backing. We like a little bit of contrast.
And some people tell me I bind upside down, so if you've seen people bind the other way, I'm sorry, this is the way I learned, and some people turn it exactly opposite of me, so you could turn your head and watch the other way if you've learned a different way.
I bind the exact same way you do.
This is just the way I was taught. So I have my knot at the very end of my string, and I'm going to go through the quilt backing. I'm not going to poke all the way through the quilt top because I don't want this to show on the other side. And all I'm doing right at this point is just trying to pull my knot inside the quilt. So I'm kind of like sinking my knot in there.
Exactly.
So I pull this through, and I'm just gonna pull through really carefully, and you can kind of feel it tug. Okay, I felt it tug. So I've got my knot sunk in there, and then all I do is take, I call it like, it's really just a couple threads of your quilt backing. Remember, don't go through your whole thing. You're just going through the quilt backing. let me see if I can show you this a little better. So I've got my thing right there. I'm going to go, this one is coming up through the binding. This one is going through the quilt backing, not through to the quilt front, and then it's going to pop up right into the binding.
Perfect.
And then all I'm going to do is pull that, and you're going to watch that stitch disappear a little. It should if you've done it right. See, you can hardly see it. It just looks like there's a little tiny catch in the fabric. I'll do it one more time. So I've got it coming through the binding. I'm just going to catch the backing, making sure not to come through the whole thing, poke it through to the top, and then you're just going to watch that stitch go into the quilt, kind of under the quilt.
Beautiful.
And then you're just going to continue this all the way around.
And this is how we've bound, I don't know how many quilts. And when I first started doing this, I thought, how is that little tiny thread and this needle that I'm going around the edge, how is that going to hold the binding onto my quilt? But on our family quilts that have gone through the wash dozens of times, it's always held the binding.
The other trick is not to use super long strands of fabric. So even if you did have a piece pull out, it might only be like an 8 or a 12-inch section that you would have
long
to...
strands of thread.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, long strands of thread.
I'm
So
glad
if
you could read my mind right there.
Yeah, so if a piece does pop out, you only have this little section to mend.
And not
instead of
half the
whole.
quilt. Yeah. So this is the same process you're going to do when you come to the corners. Here, I'm just going to jump to the corner right here. So what I like to do is just come up here and catch. I'm going to try and catch both sides of that corner as I'm coming through. And I'm going to have a really long line because obviously I didn't do it correctly. But then I'm just going to catch it underneath just to make sure I have both sides, and I'm really trying to get that corner done really well. Oh, and I didn't catch it right. It didn't hide in the back. I caught it too much. But normally it's going to come on this side and it's going to pull up right here, and then you're going to catch it right through the bottom of that quilt.
So you'll work your way all the way around the entire perimeter of your quilt until you come back to where you started. And do you want to show us how to tie that off at the end? Because when you get to the end, you're going to have this piece here. And so I'm going to make Elizabeth show us what to do, how to tie this guy off.
I'm not sure if I do it the same way you do, but I tend to just tie a little bit of a knot right around here, kind of like a French knot, and then I do that same thing where I tuck it in between the quilt layers to try and keep all of my knots inside my quilt.
That's exactly what I do, and I pull it through and snip that guy and lose it inside.
Yep, and then it's all inside and tucked in there, never to come out, hopefully.
All right, now that you've finished making your quilt, we have one more project that you can do. Along with the course, there is a free downloadable pillow pattern that you can do as well that will incorporate all the techniques that you've learned in all 3 of these lessons. It will incorporate the half square triangles, it will incorporate quilting, and it will be a lot of fun to make. It's, like I said, it's along with your course, and it's a free downloadable pattern.
And if you'd love to see more projects from us, you can join us at our website, www.simplesimonandco.com, where we love to share free patterns, tutorials, quilt blocks of the month, showing how to take traditional blocks and make them modern. And we love to hear from you.
Or even see a picture of the quilt that you've made today. Thank you so much for letting us be here with you and for joining us for this class. We've had a lot of fun, and we hope that now that you're done, you feel confident enough to attempt making your own quilts.